Hey, all right, guys, we are back and just a couple more presenters to go. Thank you so much for sticking with us if you're watching live. And if you're watching on the replay, thank you for checking out this incredible day that we've had with so many wonderful presenters in the 2021 Practical Magic celebration that is being brought to you by the generous spirit of the faculty of the Inner Alchemy Mystery School. I'm so grateful for everybody who's presented today. I know that 30 minutes, we've learned from this, if nothing else, 30 minutes is not enough time for us to even scratch the surface on some of these things. So you can look forward in the future to these being 2-day events where we break up the faculty into 2 groups and give everybody a little more time to be able to really dig in. But our next class begins in just a minute or so. This is a live and interactive broadcast. We ask you just a couple quick things. If you're watching from the Facebook group, the private Facebook group, make sure you click the link that says streamyard.com/Facebook to give Facebook permission to show us who you are. We are technically not allowed to put comments up when we don't know who they're coming from, and that'll allow your picture and your name to show up on the comment. Keep your comments short. Unfortunately, longer comments don't work on the screen. But even if you do have a longer comment, don't don't refuse to ask it. Ask the question, and then when the session is over, our amazing instructors will answer those questions afterward. Even if you're watching on the replay and you have a question before, be sure to ask those questions because we will answer those. And as I've said all day long, stick around at the end of today's event, which there's just one other presenter after this presentation, and then I'm going to take you on the inside for a sneak peek behind the curtain. But we will then be doing a random drawing for 2 prizes. The grand prize is worth more than $900. The second prize worth more than $700. And so let's go ahead and dig in. I got to tell you, our next presenter is another one of those people who has been such a vital part of the work that we do at the Mystery School. In addition to being a cherished friend and brother, a gifted practitioner, Dominick Guerriero's workshop on spiritual mediumship, working with the guides, is probably one of the most anticipated classes today. Several people have been messaging me and saying, I want to make sure I don't miss it. What time is it? I apologize that I didn't post the schedule. I don't know how I forgot that, but we are privileged to have this gifted magical practitioner in Babalao sharing with us today. So I don't want to take up any more of his time. Let's see if I can chew gum and talk at the same time, which I've proven all day long I can't, and get this show on the road.
Good afternoon, everyone. Minor correction, I am a Babalarisha, not a Babalao. Slight difference, but that as far as my background goes, I am a priest or a Babalarisha of Afro-Brazilian Candomblé, and that intersects with our topic today, which is spirit guides and mediumship, and how does that differ than ancestral communication and veneration. So the 2 courses that I teach in the Inner Alchemy platform are a tarot cartomancy class and a course which is an overview on the traditions, the religious, spiritual, and magical traditions of Latin America. And both of these areas intersect with mediumship. So to get right in, this is a question I get a lot, from clients, from students, from friends, is I can't hear, I can't see, I cannot feel my ancestors. I don't sense their presence. I'm not sure of what I'm feeling. And you know what? I want to tell you this is okay. This is normal. Even someone like myself who has been doing this for decades goes through these periods where you might be closed off to it for various reasons, and you may have to seek help outside of yourself, maybe to an elder or a colleague, which is what happened to me. I had to see a colleague of mine that is a spiritualist and get a reading because there was something going on with the spirit guides on that side of my spirituality, because I was constantly communicating with my ancestors, but there was this deficiency with my guides, and it had to be corrected because we need, if you think about it, they're both on your side. They're both part of your spiritual team, but I will explain there is a distinct difference between them. So my first guide that I encountered was when I was a teenager, and I'm going to date myself now. I got this book in the 90s when I was in the 11th grade, The Pillars of Isis, and it's like a complete magical and meditation system, and it had an exercise, a meditation to contact your spirit guide, and my spirit guide was an Egyptian priest. Now that particular guide was not one of my main guides. It was a guide that was around from my teenage years to the point when I was first initiated into candomblé, when I was like around 26, 27. And then after that, that was basically his mission, was to get me to that point to become initiated as a priest. And then my main guide started to take over a little bit before then. So this could be another reason too that there is this gap, is that some guides are temporary and some are permanent. Some are with us from the moment that we come into this world to the very moment that we leave this earth. Okay. So basically, if you're having trouble, if you're having blockages, I'm going to talk about how to strengthen that connection and what to do to resolve that. So I'm going to start off with a little funny story. So I know this one priestess of Oya, a Santera, and Oya is the mother, the queen of the dead in my tradition, and her children are very direct. So she was talking about another witch that she knew that was a mutual friend of ours that was going through this period of confusion where she didn't know who was her friend and who was her foe. So she exclaimed in her thick Bronx accent, was, "What's up with her? Is she not a witch? Don't her muertos tell her things? Like, don't her spirit guides communicate with her?" Which is, she was the word for the dead in Spanish, muertos. She's like, what's wrong with her? Like, shouldn't she go to her guides to let her know who's has her back and who doesn't? Okay, so that's an example of what the spirit guides do. They are there for our protection and our guidance. That is their function. And that is very different from what the ancestors do, although there is an intersection, of course. So I am going to start with this quote. We're getting a little academic here. All right, so again, I'm dating myself. This book is from 1992. It's falling apart. I've had it since I was a teenager. It's called Earth God Rising. So it's a book. It's a devotional kind of book for the Wiccan Horned God, because I was more into that when I was a teenager. And the author was an occultist, was a magician, but he was also someone who attended spiritualist churches in England, which are, spiritualism is mediumship, um, albeit more with a more Christian lens, and I'll get to that in a second. So basically, he was talking about, and I'm going to read the passage now. The information in here has changed, but it's kind of to give us this idea. When I first started my spiritual journey, I did not hear a lot about ancestor veneration. I did not hear a lot about spiritual guides. It was more about deities, right? Um, from the neo-pagan and the Wiccan community. When I started to hear about spiritual guides, it was more from like the New Age community, and also the Santeria, the Espiritismo, the Afro-Caribbean groups more talked about spirit guides and ancestors. And now this has changed, though. I would say in 2021, we hear a lot more from those communities about ancestor veneration. Back when I was a teenager, I didn't hear much about ancestors except around this time of year, around Samhain, around Halloween, where people would talk about, oh, it's time to get in touch with your ancestors. Whereas in Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian groups or other traditional or indigenous cultures, ancestral veneration and contact with spirit guides is something year round. It's a day-to-day thing or it's a weekly thing, but it's definitely something that is more prevalent. But now we see in other traditions, they talk more about this. So Alan Richardson in this book, he basically is talking about how witches at one point were more akin to spiritualists and vice versa, that they were actually part of the same group. And we think of figures like the witch of Endor in the Hebrew Bible, who was a medium. She called it the spirit of the prophet Samuel for King Saul. But sometimes she's referred to as a witch, and there's a debate, and we're not going to get into that too much. But that is an example of mediumship, or in some cases can be described as necromancy. So he says about spiritualism and witchcraft, and he's more referring to neo-pagan Wicca in this because this is from 1992. At first glance, this seems absurd, but they are in fact two parts of one formidable equation. Many spiritualists today are linked by previous existence in which they functioned quite simply as witches. Unfortunately, the spiritualist movement itself is too often limited by its rather brittle and apparently shallow dogma, and shaded over by the infernally Christian nature of its approach. It is invariably and unfairly seen as the refuge of the weak, simple, and elderly. Like they talk about mediums kind of like preying upon, and especially in the past, preying upon like people that were bereaved or grieving, and that still happens today, unfortunately. On the other hand, as far as Wicca goes, there are very few witches around today who have 1/10 of the extraordinary talents and healing abilities the best spiritual mediums have. They know a great deal about occult philosophies and have entirely laudable green attitudes, but they are often too sadly lacking in any real power. If the two were able to combine somehow so that we would get a spiritualist movement with passionate nature links in a magical sense, and which was not afraid of sex, or else a witch with a full and deep complement of spiritualist powers, then we would have a potent mix indeed. We would have a shamanic figure ripe to wear the crown of a nearly forgotten god. So he talks about witchcraft and spiritualism as being two pillars of a broken gate, and that his whole hope was that one day that these would fuse together, and we have seen that. We are seeing more witches into mediumship. We are seeing more mediums explore witchcraft, and vice versa. And really, in certain cultures, there's not really a separation between the two. And sometimes people ask, what's the difference maybe between a psychic and a medium? And we'll get into that. Psychics use the five senses like clairaudience and clairsentience and clairvoyance, whereas mediumship uses that plus the communications with ancestors and spirit guides to gain and gather information. So basically, if I had to break it down, ancestors are your blood or adopted relatives, okay, your family members. And of course, there's also ancestors of culture, of place, um, heroes of certain ethnic backgrounds and time periods. And spirit guides are different. Spirit guides are not blood related, not usually. I mean, there are rare cases where a spirit guide is like maybe your 50th cousin once removed, because at one point we all start to look related. And also your spirit guide is also someone else's ancestor. If you think about it, your particular guide that walks with you and helps you is somebody's great grandmother or great grandfather. So that puts your head a little bit into a twist. But basically, their agendas intersect but also divide, because the ancestors help you, but they also could be problematic, especially the ones that maybe were problematic when they were alive or were abusive. And they also have their own agenda too. So the dead collectively have an agenda, generally to keep the ancestral line going, to produce offspring. And I myself have like experienced that, where great grandma's like, when are you gonna have kids? When are you gonna get married? And so forth. So that sometimes is part of their agenda. Not with every family though. Spirit guides, their agenda is primarily you. Their whole mission And not to say that they won't tell you if you're, screwing up a little bit, like, your ancestors will. Um, their whole mission is to help you. And yes, they are also on their path of elevation. It's a reciprocal relationship. You help them elevate by working with them, and they help you in your spiritual life, or they may act as protectors, they may act as guardians, they may act as counselors. So the ancestors and spirit guides are two parts of your spiritual team. And of course, there are deities, there are animal spirits, there are plant spirits. We have a whole plethora of spirits that um, walk with us. But basically, that's where their agenda sometimes diverges, because the ancestors, they want to help you, but they also have their own collective agenda. But the spirit guides are mainly for you. Um, basically, a lot of people ask this question: can you have your ancestors and spirit guides on the same altar? Now, the answer will vary from tradition to religious practice and so forth. Personally, because of space, because I live in New York City, I have them on the same altar, and also in my tradition that is considered okay. In another tradition that might be considered taboo. Again, go according to what you practice and what works for you. Um, and the simplest thing you can do for them is have a glass of water, because water provides refreshment. And also, when you see bubbles in the water, that's an indication. And that's a thing. If you're not hearing the ancestors or spirit guides or seeing them, the bubbles in the water are a clear indication that there is spiritual activity. So you put the glass of water on your altar, and you put a candle, usually a white candle. Um, Now, in Afro-Brazilian traditions, we tend to put the candle behind the water, because water is a stronger element and puts out fire, that we have the water in front of the candle. But in other traditions, they may arrange the glass or the glasses of water differently. Again, it goes according to what your tradition is. Now, just to go back a little bit, the major interest in mediumship happened in the 19th century during the Victorian era. There was an obsession almost with contacting the dead. Um, and it was kind of like a form of entertainment for the middle and upper classes. And this is how various spiritual movements or spiritist movements or spiritualism movements started in the United States. Actually, in New York, there was one, and also in Europe, in France, with Allan Kardec, who's very famous as the founder of the Spiritist movement. And again, that's what Alan Richardson is talking about in the book, that very Christian overlaid Spiritism. And his, not to get too much into him, but his first aim was to debunk mediums and spiritualists and prove them as frauds. But when he started to go to various mediums, he became convinced that they were speaking the truth, that they were actually communicating with the other side. And then he codified the medium's writing in his books, and they are still available today. There's also a really good movie on Netflix called Kardec, which explains how he started the movement. And then this interest in spiritualism goes into Latin America and mixes with the African and indigenous traditions that are already present. And we get this new variety of Espiritismo and Umbanda and so forth. Yes, I see the Casadega. Yes, Casadega in Florida is one, and I believe there's one in upstate New York called Lilydale, which is a very a town full of mediums. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered that, the main thing when you do any kind of work with either ancestors or spirit guides, and this is a word of advice too, just because your spirit guide was, say, a priestess of Oshun or a Hindu guru, that does not give you the right to practice that, especially if those religions are closed practices. So that is very important, okay? Because I have various Native American spirits. You do not see me claiming to be a Native American practitioner of whatever ethnic group that they belong to. So be very careful with that. You can have spirits from any cultural background. They may even come from past lives in some cases, but that doesn't entitle the person to practice whatever tradition their practice is. Their main objective is to guide you. Now, their practice may align with yours. You may have been assigned that God because you're going to become part of this religion or tradition, and that does happen. Um, but basically, I have guides that are Romani, I have guides that are Native American, I have guides that are African. That doesn't mean that I have the right to access those practices, but they do help me in my practices and in my divination. Um, so basically, you want to cleanse your space and protect yourself first. Invoke any deities or entities that you work with for protection. Usually, like when someone has a spiritualist misa in Latin America, they do their Catholic prayers, they do the Spiritist prayers as a way of not to be Christian, but to kind of set up this area of protection so that negative spirits don't enter. And as Ellen likes to say, we want to make sure that it's not Susie from down the street that's talking to us. We want to make sure that it's great grandma or our spiritual guide. Or as I like to say, I want to make sure it's not Joe Schmo who passed away 5 months ago that lived 2 doors down. I want to make sure that it's the actual entity that I'm speaking to. So cleanse and protect first, and then you utilize the 5 spiritual senses, and and you go from there. Now there's various ways to do this. All right. So one form that's very common is something called automatic writing, where you just kind of sit with your notebook, and sometimes people you see them, they just scribble on the page with a pencil or a pen. And I went to a Spiritismo Misa one time um, in Manhattan, and the Santera was like she scribbled on the whole page, but then all the messages from her spirit guide started to come out after that. Another form of this that I like to do is kind of a Q&A session with the guide. So I write out the question that I have for them, and then I, wait, and then I write down whatever answer comes through either the clairaudience or whatnot. Now, if you don't have the develop of the clairvoyant, again, this is another way to kind of develop that. So automatic writing does help. Other ways to communicate are through music, through songs, and to be a little new agey, the repetitive, the 1111 numbers, and signs. If you read tarot, you could do a spread to see who the spirit guide is. They may communicate through the cards. You may dedicate, especially if you have a Romani spirit or a Sibyl or a Pythoness, as we call them, a spirit that's specialized in divination. You can dedicate that deck to them and use it as a form of communication. So for me, like with one of my decks, when I would get the Queen of Cups, for example, I knew that was one of my ancestors that was a Celtic priestess. And I would go to like spiritualist meetings and circles, and people would see her, the mediums would see her. So it was confirmed that her presence was always around. In fact, sometimes my godfather, my spiritual elder, sees her and he's like, "Oh, the blonde woman is back." And I'm like, "Okay, what's she want?" Another example is the Princess or Page of Swords for me represents a particular Sicilian spirit that I have that's really feisty. And in the rare occasion this does happen, like sometimes her and her ancestors have a conversation about me, like I'm not in the room, like I'm suddenly like 12 years old and they're like talking. It's not fun. Okay. So and when you do readings for others, you ask permission from their guides and their ancestors. So I see Dea has a question here about automatic writing. So let's say I was doing a reading for Dea. I would ask permission from her ancestors and her spiritual guides to provide me with more information. So this way you're not utilizing all your 5 spiritual senses. You're not getting drained as much. Her guides and her ancestors are going to speak to you or speak to your spirits. And it becomes kind of like this 3 or 4-way conversation between the different sides. It could be very interesting after a while. So and we get to this point too, like, when do you ask for help? Okay. So in my case, I had to ask for help when I was having that blockage with my spirit guides. And sometimes these blocks come when we're overusing our spiritual practices, because technically it's not normal when we're always experiencing spiritual phenomenon. When I was younger, like, I would channel the spirit and they would just come out sometimes at inappropriate times. Like, you don't want to be talking to your boss at work and your Romany spirit, who's like really feisty, comes through and she starts like telling off your boss, and then all of a sudden you're out of a job. That's not good. Um, so like, that could be, the blockage could be in place for a reason. Like, maybe you need to work on your own spiritual development and set up that time for them at home so that they're not coming out and, reading the riot act to certain people, because it has happened to me. And thankfully my elders were able to kind of put me in check after that. Another blockage could be just negativity, or if someone is doing work against you, um, the spell or whatever they've done will try to separate you from your guides and ancestors so that you feel helpless, right? And you feel like you have nowhere to turn to, and then you start to get more depressed and feeling bad. Again, that is something that has happened to me, and I've seen it with clients. um Nicole has a question. What about connecting with your council, the group that you work with to choose your new life? So your spirit guides are your council. Your spirit guides and your ancestors are your council, basically. They act as your um, advisors. And again, they have two different agendas sometimes, but sometimes they overlap. Like when my Sicilian spirit and one of my um, Lucanian ancestors talk, oof, you don't want to be there. And they start criticizing you. Another way to ask reason to ask for help is maybe to even identify who they are. So you can get a reading from a medium or someone that works with spirit guides and ancestors so they can identify them properly. Maybe they've introduced themselves to you, but you might want to confirm it to make sure it's not Joe Schmo from down the street, or Susie from apartment 2B. Or also if there's a spirit attached, like some spirits, because they see us developing in our energy, we start to our aura starts to look tasty and bright, they will latch on. And in the South, and Adam could probably talk about this in his class, or I think he may have covered it, like it's called a haint, where this obsessive spirit leeches onto you. That is very hard to take off by oneself, no matter how experienced you are. You should go to either an elder or a colleague that you trust to remove that entity from you, because again, it will start to cut off contact with the guides and the ancestors, and you know make you have conflicts with the people around you, and all of a sudden, you're wondering why you feel isolated and so forth. So that is, you know um a reason to ask for help, uh when, because most of the things you can do yourself, speaking to the spirit guides, you can give them very simple offerings like black coffee or rice that doesn't have any salt. Like particularly in Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian traditions, like salt is something that the dead do not like. In other cultures, that is perfectly permissible. So again, it depends, on what tradition you're practicing, and what you're following, and so forth. So yeah, does anyone have any questions? I know I covered a lot. I may have spoke too fast. Um, write any comments or questions. Do you have any advice for haint prevention? Yes. Okay. Haints tend to strike when you're going through difficult times. So sometimes a person, like a friend or a family member, will give you a gift to kind of brighten your disposition up. They may take you for a walk. They may put salt on the back of your neck because sometimes the spirits enter through that way. The stomach is another way. They may, in some cultures, they may give you like a belt or something to wear, a red sash or something to block that energy. But generally, haints, um, they tend to be attracted when you're feeling down. So any of those things will work. And I'm sure Adam can speak more about that too.
Well, we are once again, almost out of time. That is just a scratching of the surface, folks, for the value that Dominic brings to his courses. And there are more than one course in the platform presently that he's teaching, and more, I'm sure, to come as the years go on. So I encourage everybody to stick around. At the end, I'm going to take you for a peek behind the curtain so you can actually see what it is that it will allow you to tap into the wisdom and insight that so many people bring. Dominic, I want to thank you just so much for that, and like everything that you do. I mean, even the classes you do in the platform leave you wanting for more, like not wanting it to end. This is certainly no exception to that. Thank you again
Thank you.
for spending time with us today. And folks, keep the questions coming. We'll have Dominic check those out after the broadcast. So I love you, brother. We'll see you
Love you too.
later on. And guys, we are almost at the finish line. Almost time to make that to make that drawing. In just a little bit, you're going to hear from somebody that many of you have had the I don't know if it's a pleasure or not to see on screen. My Zia Angelina Serafina Tutagoza will be coming up in just a minute. I should actually probably take Dominic's name down. He is much better looking than me. That is not Dominic on the screen. That's me. But I'll look forward to seeing you guys. Well, actually, Angelina will look forward to seeing you in about 15 minutes. So stick around, and we'll be back right after this.